Hello everyone, and welcome to Shared Drive Cleanup. My name is Ethan Anderson. I am the Government Records Archivist for the Kansas Historical Society, and I will be guiding you through this presentation today, so let's go ahead and get started. To begin with, I want to be clear what we're discussing when we talk about shared drives. So shared drives are disk drives or network drives that allow multiple users of a local network to store and share files simultaneously. Typically, a shared drive is known by a particular letter, so at your agency you may refer to it as the K drive or the S drive or the W drive. Each of those letter drives is a separate shared drive. Shared drives can be very convenient, but they also present a number of records management challenges. First, shared drives are inherently decentralized. They allow numerous users to create, save, and arrange records according to what they think makes sense. And chances are what makes sense to that one individual does not make sense to everyone at your agency. This is going to make it more difficult to know exactly what records you have and where they are located. The decentralized nature of shared drives also makes it difficult to know if your retention schedules are being followed. Chances are that records which should be destroyed on a fairly regular basis are now simply being kept forever. And I know I said this in our Records Management 101 training, but I want to reiterate it here. It is a really bad idea to keep everything forever. It's going to put added stress on your network, it's going to increase your storage costs, and it will make it more difficult and time-consuming to respond to core requests. Allowing multiple people to save records how they see fit is also going to make it difficult to tell where exactly your record copy is located. If you have 5 copies of the same record stored in 5 different places, how do you know which one is considered the official record copy and which ones are simply convenience copies? Keeping things in numerous locations will probably also affect morale and productivity at your agency. If things aren't organized in a clear, logical way, people are going to be looking all over the place to find the records they need, which can be incredibly frustrating and time-consuming. Chances are that your shared drive is not new either, which means that you are going to be running into records you can't open because they're in old formats or require old software that you no longer have. Lastly, security and access can be an issue with shared drives. Take your personnel and payroll records, for example. Do only those people who need to access those files have permission to access them, or does everyone in your agency have access to them? Also, are records which should be restricted marked in any way, or do you have no idea if a file contains, let's say, a social security number until you open that file? I always like to provide examples of what you should and shouldn't do, so here's a random folder I found when I was recently cleaning up our shared drive a bit. As you can see, we have multiple formats in this folder. I'm seeing Word 97, XSW files, WPD files, XML files, rich text format files, a little bit of everything. Even worse, the names of these files are not very helpful. Most of them are labeled EAD, which means nothing to me. A lot of them even have the exact or incredibly similar titles, which again is not very helpful. Luckily, I can at least tell who created most of these files, and since that individual hasn't been with our agency for over 5 years, chances are I can delete most of these records. But again, I would definitely consider this folder as an example to avoid. So now that you know why having a clean, logical shared drive is important, how should you go about cleaning up your shared drive? The first step is to organize a team for this task. This team should include your agency records officer, a member of your IT staff, a senior administrator, and some of your end users. This team should begin by defining the scope of this project. Will they be cleaning up multiple shared drives, one shared drive, or just a portion of one shared drive? How will responsibilities be organized? Will each person be in charge of cleaning up a separate folder, or will each person be in charge of separate tasks, like converting or renaming files? Also, when do you expect this cleanup to be completed? Keep in mind that this process can definitely be a slog. Depending on what your drive looks like, it'll probably take a lot longer to clean up than you originally planned on. Next, your team should conduct an inventory of the drive or drives you'll be working on. They should decide whether the current structure makes sense. It's very possible that it doesn't, and that at least portions of it should be changed completely. Also, figure out how many files you have and what formats they're in. Will you need to purchase software to access these records? There are websites available to help convert these old files into accessible formats, but if you're dealing with a large number of outdated formats, this process can be fairly time-consuming, so it may be easiest to look into buying software to help speed up this process. One of the most important parts of the cleanup process, and the part that should make your life much easier going forward, is establishing some policies and procedures. Decide where your record copy should be kept. Also, figure out what format your record copy should be kept in. For example, at the Historical Society, we keep all of our record copy Word documents in PDF format rather than .docx. Our thinking was that PDFs seem much more stable in the long run. Microsoft will probably be updating its formats again at some point, but PDFs should basically be around forever. Also, come up with some naming guidelines. We'll get into this more in just a bit, but figure out what information you should include in your file names. If you're a licensing agency, will people be searching for these records by the last name of the licensee, the license number, the date the license was issued, or all three? Another great idea is to have some accountability. Set up user histories rather than having everyone simply labeled as an administrator. That way, like with the example I showed earlier, if you know who created a record or last updated that record, it'll help you figure out whether or not it is still current. You may also consider setting up what's called a ghost drive. This is an exact copy of your shared drive where you are free to make any changes you want without any repercussions. Then at some logical point, you switch the two, making your ghost drive the new version of your shared drive and then hiding your original shared drive. I'd still suggest keeping the original drive as a backup for a few years, just to ensure that all records that you need to retain and have access to have been transferred over. And lastly, while going through this process, be sure to communicate with your entire staff. Let them know when this cleanup is going to begin, when it will likely be finished, and what changes they can expect. If you're using a ghost drive, be sure to tell your staff when you're making the switch from your original drive to the ghost drive. People are really going to freak out if suddenly they can't find their records and all the folders and files have been renamed without their knowledge. Like I said, this is going to be a long, drawn-out process, but there are some simple steps you can take to start with. The best thing to do is really to start small. Do a few easy tasks or a few small folders first to test your process and then build off that success. Some easy tasks you can begin with are deleting duplicate files and deleting empty folders. Remember that you only need to have one record copy. All other copies are considered convenience copies and can be destroyed whenever they are no longer useful. Also, resolve file names. Rename files with non-meaningful names and shorten those with incredibly long names. You'll need to keep in mind that the standard character limit for a file name is 256 characters. That character limit includes both the file name itself as well as the pathway to get to that file. So if something is kept 12 folders deep, chances are that you'll be getting close to that character limit even before you start naming that file. If you do exceed this character limit, you'll probably have some issues if you ever need to transfer these files, or you might have issues with backing them up on your server. You should also consider moving orphan files. Orphan files are files that are located with a bunch of other folders. So in a particular pathway, you have a list of available folders and then one or two files also in that list. Those one or two files are called orphan files. And then lastly, reformat files that are obsolete or in danger of obsolescence and make sure to extract all of your zipped files. For whatever reason, zipped files can be more prone to bit rot, which we talked about in our electronic records presentation, is when the ones and zeros of a file just magically switch places. So be sure to extract all of those files to help keep them safe from bit rot. Now, when it comes to file naming guidelines, we have a few suggestions for you to consider. First of all, keep your guidelines simple. If they are too lengthy or confusing, people will simply ignore them. The most important thing I can recommend is to be consistent. Do what makes sense for your agency and what you can be sure will be implemented. We want you to think about longevity as well. How are people going to be wanting to access these records in the future? Again, if you are a licensing agency, perhaps you'll want to include the licensee's last name in the file name, or the license number, or the date the license was issued. It's likely that you'll need all three of those pieces of information, so is there a particular order they should be in? Be sure to plan ahead as well. If you have 500 photos that you need to organize, don't start labeling them Photo 1, Photo 2, Photo 3. Label them Photo 001, 002, and so on. Obviously, label them something more descriptive than just photo, but you get the gist. Also, be sure not to use any special characters, so no $signs, hashtags, ampersands. In addition, some software has issues recognizing spaces, so I'd suggest using dashes or underscores instead of spaces. Figure out how you should refer to dates. At the Historical Society, we deal with a lot of records going back decades, so we always include dates starting with the year, followed by the month, and then the date. If you have paper records associated with your electronic records, make sure that they are both named similarly or in such a way that they refer back to one another in a logical way. With whatever you decide, be proactive. Provide training to your employees on these guidelines to make sure they abide by them. It's much easier to ensure compliance on the ground floor when the file is being created, rather than to expect people to go back and rename all the files they've created or used in the past few years. In terms of long-term implementation, make sure you have a directory structure that makes sense. Has your agency been reorganized since your shared drive was created? Have new divisions been created that aren't adequately called out in your shared drive? Also, make sure that proper classifications and restrictions are in place. If a folder contains restricted materials, does that folder name include an R or something else to alert you to that fact? Are records which should be kept permanently labeled as such? If a folder needs only to be kept 3 fiscal years, should you include the date in the title of when that folder can be destroyed? Again, make sure to conduct training to ensure compliance on whatever you decide. You may even want to institute something like a cleanup day once a year or once a quarter, where everyone tackles a few folders or double checks that everything they have created is properly labeled and filed. When you've completed your cleanup process, do an after-action report. Make an honest assessment of what your team did, what worked, what didn't work, and what do you still need to work on going forward. Cleaning up your shared drive is going to be like records management in general. Just because this process has been completed doesn't mean that you are completely done. You still have to continue to abide by these naming guidelines and folder structures going forward. When it comes to creating an efficient directory structure, we encourage you to start by organizing your top-level folders by business function. For example, at the State Archives, we have different top-level folders for things like our public records program, reference services, collections management, outreach efforts, administration, fiscal records, and volunteers. Another good idea is to limit who can rename or create new top-level folders. This is to make sure you have some oversight over the management of your records. Again, one of the issues with shared drives is that typically things are very decentralized, so anyone can create anything and store it anywhere. We also recommend that you limit the number of subfolders within a folder to about 6 levels deep. If you have a longer file path than that, remember you may exceed that 256 character limit and have issues if you ever need to migrate those files. Also, try to avoid having redundant folder names. It makes sense if you're dealing with, say, accounts payable and subdividing your folders by years and months. But it wouldn't make sense to have a folder named Photos, for instance, and then another folder named Photos within a conference folder. And then perhaps the easiest thing you can do to help organize your directory structure is to delete empty folders. Obviously, they aren't serving a purpose, so just go ahead and get rid of them. Here we have 2 examples of folder structures. The one on the left is a good, logical structure. As you can see, accounting is split up into accounts payable, accounts receivable, and payroll, and all the subfolders are split up by years and months. Makes perfect sense. The only suggestion I would make in this example is to use dashes or underscores instead of spaces, but otherwise it looks great. The example on the right is obviously not nearly as clear-cut and logical. You have a bunch of different acronyms going on, like ANSI and AJV. There are special characters being used, and just overall, most of these folder names are not at all descriptive. The folder after, for instance, doesn't give you much of an idea at all about what files may be found within that folder. For better or worse, I like to share what we do at our agency so you know if we are practicing what we preach. So this is the folder where we pulled this presentation from. As you can see, we're 5 folders deep here, so that's good. And everything has a descriptive name and the words are all separated by an underscore. So I'd say in this instance, we are definitely doing a good job and living up to our own standards. Now, this isn't the case with all of our folders. We definitely have a significant number of folders containing old, unreadable formats or that are not very descriptively labeled, but I'd say at least going forward, we're in pretty good shape. If you're interested in what programs or tools are out there that you can use to help clean up your shared drive, I have 3 that I have a little experience with and would recommend. Full disclosure, I'm not here to sell any of these products, so if you want to use them, great, and if not, that's fine too. I just want to give you an idea of some of the options out there. The first software I'd recommend considering is TreeSize Professional. TreeSize is a disk space manager, so it will scan your hard drive and show you how your storage space is being used so that you can then begin the cleanup process. It'll show you where your largest files are, how old those files are, who created them, who last modified or accessed them, etc. Overall, I'd say it's a pretty good, aesthetic, and user-friendly tool. Last I checked, it does cost about $55 per license, so just be aware of that. There's also NoClone, which is a deduplication software. TreeSize has some deduplication software as well, but NoClone is strictly deduplication. It will scan whatever drives you point it to and tell you if you have multiple copies of that record in multiple locations. One of the great things about NoClone, and I think TreeSize does this as well, is that the records don't have to be exact copies of each other for you to be able to find them. You can say you want to find matches that are 90% or 80% the same, and the software will still be able to find those records. That way, if you're looking for an earlier draft of a final report, you should still be able to find it. One of the great things about NoClone also is that it's free. You can download the trial version, use it for a while, and then whenever the trial version is over, you can delete it and download a new trial version. I'm sure they'll fix that at some point, but at least for now, it's free to use. And then last but not least is Directory Opus, which is a file management software. I like to say that Directory Opus is sort of similar to normal Windows formats, but it gives you a ton of additional options for viewing and managing your files. It's a really powerful tool, and it does have some deduplication software, but the issue that we found with Directory Opus is that it has a pretty steep learning curve. So if you don't have a background in IT, or if you aren't willing to put in the time to figure it out, it's probably not the software for you. Directory Opus runs about $60 per license. Now we have some screenshots of these 3 software examples, so let's dive a little deeper into them. TreeSize has a very similar look and feel to Windows, so it's quite easy to use. Simply point the software at the drive you want to scan, tell it to scan the directory, and it'll provide you with a number of options for understanding your results. You can view them as a pie chart, bar graph, whatever works best for you. You can also sort your results by file type, file size, or by when they were created or last modified. This last option can be really helpful when it comes to instituting your agency's retention schedules. In the left screenshot, you can see that over 75% of the results were last modified over 2 years ago. If you know that the retention period for records in this folder is only 1 year, that means you can delete the vast majority of files in this particular folder. TreeSize also has some deduplication software. It is possible to have the program automatically delete one of the 2 files, but we highly recommend you do not do that. NoClone is very similar to the deduplication software found in TreeSize. You simply tell the program which 2 drives or folders you want to scan, and it will list all the duplicate files it managed to find. It will place these findings together in color-coded rows and give you the pathway to each file, so it's pretty intuitive and user-friendly. And last but not least is Directory Opus. As you can see, there are a lot of different display options with this program, and it can give you a lot of information on your files. You can view multiple folders at the same time, and if you've got image files, it can show you right off the bat what camera the item was shot with and what settings were used when the image was taken. It also has a ton of different search options. You can search for files by metadata, file size, file type, or when it was created or last modified. Overall, it's just a super powerful program and has a ton of various search and display options. However, unless you're a professional photographer or really technologically savvy, it may be more powerful of a tool than you really need. Alright, I do have some resources listed here for you. There are a number of tutorials out there for all 3 of these software examples, so if you're interested in using any of them, I'd recommend going to YouTube. That's really how I taught myself how to be somewhat proficient with these programs. And that is all I have for you today. As always, thank you for attending this presentation, and please contact me if you have any questions.